Hey, welcome back. I'm excited to launch a Teachable Machine plugin for TouchDesigner. It allows you to train super lightweight machine learning models, like an image classifier, a sound detection model, and a pose detection model that you can embed into TouchDesigner without having to do any programming. So let's say you train like a banana detector. You can save it as a standalone tox file and then bring it into your other projects once it's prepped. In this tutorial, I'm going to go through and show you how to train your own models using the Teachable Machine website. And then I'm going to show you how to set up some general networks. For example, if you want to switch between some different visuals that you've created or trigger different audio effects, depending on what the machine learning model is recognizing. So it'll look something like this.
The banana, Torin. Water bottle, Torin. Background, Torin.
The Teachable Machine plugin is going to be available on my Patreon, so I'll put a link to that in the description. And let's go ahead and get started by heading on over to the Teachable Machine website, which I'll also put a link to in the description. All right, so first thing we're going to do, go ahead and get started. And we're going to start by doing an image recognition project. So in this case, we're going to use the standard image model. And the first thing we're going to do is, it's really helpful to have a kind of background classification. So this is kind of the neutral state when it's not really detecting anything. So we'll just call this background. And what we can do here is turn on the webcam, and then we will hold and record the background. So I'll move out of the frame for this.
Background.
So then let's go ahead and do one with me in it. So I'll give this the class Torin, and then I'm going to move around. So one thing to note too is that it's also picking up on like the color of my shirt and the background that it's being trained in. So if I were to swap my shirt out or something like that, it might not work the same. Let's go ahead and do the banana. Let's add in another classification. So I'll do maybe the water bottle. And then we'll get a bunch of different angles on this and move it around. And maybe let's try doing our hand, because I think this will be a good example where my hand shows up in the banana example and the water bottle. So you'll kind of see where you need to give it a bunch of examples at different angles. All right, and then let's go ahead and train. Make sure not to close this tab while the actual model is training. And then now that it's actually prepped, you can see here what it thinks that it's classifying. So you can see it's pretty high percentage of me. If I bring in my hand, actually, I'm surprised it did a pretty good job with detecting my hand. The water bottle, wow, I'm impressed. Banana. And then the background. So the interesting thing is that it's having a tough time distinguishing between the water bottle and me. So I could always give it more training samples of myself, and then, or some more training examples of the water bottle. But let's go ahead and export this model. And you could download it, but the way I've configured the plugin is that if you upload the model right here, it'll take a little bit and it'll make a shareable link for it. Once that link is generated, you can see right here, we're just going to copy only this code right here. Don't copy the slashes on either end. Once you've got that download link, go ahead and take the Teachable Machine talks from the Patreon and drag it into your TouchDesigner project. And from here, notice that this is just a default model that's loaded. And if I put down a null chop, you can see what it's classifying right now. And all we need to do is paste the custom model right here, the custom model URL here, and then click download, and that will download the machine learning model, embed it into the virtual file system. And now this model, I can right click and save this, and this will be our new classification model. And you can actually drag and drop this in to another project, and this will have everything loaded locally and will work without an internet connection, which is great. So all those little classifications are done for you, which is super, super nice. And you'll see that it automatically brought in the same classification names that we had. So we've got background, Torin, banana, water bottle, and hand. and it works great. You can also do things like select the webcam you want to use here. For the microphone model, you can select it here as well. And then you can also choose to flip the camera. But one thing to note for the camera is that it's trained on a flipped camera automatically. And so I would recommend keeping the flip turned on because it's going to match with the training data. So you're going to have better results that way. From there, let's go ahead and train the other two model types. So we're going to do audio next and then pose. And then we're going to dive into just configuring a couple quick networks with the image classification model. All right, let's go ahead and train our audio project. So for starters, we're actually going to need to have 20 seconds of background sound. And one thing I'd recommend doing is actually have a little bit of speaking in the background. If you're trying to pick up like background conversation as the background noise, have that as part of the sample. Otherwise, it'll get confused with some of your other classifications. So go ahead and record a little bit of that audio, and I'm going to speed this up for you. So for this part, I'm actually just going to talk a little bit in the background so that way it kind of just picks up general audio here, and then I'm also just going to have some larger segments of silence. And maybe just kind of like moving around a little bit. So once it's done gathering those samples, you hit extract samples. And next up, what we're going to do is create another classification. So let's take maybe keys, and I will train a couple examples on keys jingling. And then extract the samples. And notice that we need a total of 8 samples. Let's maybe add in a water bottle sound. All right, once we have enough samples, we'll go ahead and train the model. All right, so, oh, this is great. Okay. We're getting a decent amount of background noise, and then let's do the keys. And then let's try the bottle. All right, so once the model is trained, let's go ahead and export it. And go ahead and click Upload Model. Once it's done uploading, you're going to go ahead and copy the ID of the model right here from the URL. Again, make sure that you're not copying the slashes on either end. So I'm just going to copy this ID, and let's go ahead and go back over to our TouchDesigner project. So here, you can actually just duplicate your Teachable Machine component and put in the new model ID, and then click Download. So I actually configured this so it'll automatically detect which type of model it is, and then can either run the image detection, the pose, or the audio detection. I'm going to go ahead and right-click on the edge here and put down a null so we can see the data coming out, and you can see we're getting the background noise, keys. Keeps picking up the bottle quite a bit. There we go. And one thing that you can change here as well is the audio probability. And so notice that it's not updating nearly as fast as the image detection model. So the audio probability threshold here, if we set it to 0, that's going to just update constantly as fast as it can. And if we set the probability threshold up quite high, it means that it needs to think that there's at least a probability of, right now, 78.7% in order for that value to update. So that can be helpful if you want this chop data to only update occasionally. And that kind of smooths things out a little bit, actually. It has to have a higher confidence value in order for it to actually detect that. Notice that actually kind of smoothed out this bottle detection here. That kind of fixed things a little bit for us. And now let's try to bring the keys back in. There we go. And then the bottle. Cool. So that seems to be working quite a bit better. All right, let's go ahead and do our pose detection. So class 1, maybe we'll do a pose where no one's in the frame, because one thing you could potentially do is use this to detect if someone is in front of your installation or not. So we'll make one called background. We'll start up the webcam, and then I'll just record this out of the frame entirely. All right, And then now let's go ahead and do neutral. So I'm going to kind of move around a little bit. And then I'll do another one that's like a Y pose. And the tricky part is that if I try to do a Y pose, I can't hold down the actual button to record. So one thing that you'll notice in here is there's this little settings section, and you can hold the record on for a certain amount of time. So we can hold this, let's say delay it for 2 seconds and then record for 6 seconds. So we'll save that setting. So now I can hit record. All right. So we're able to get that in, and let's go ahead and maybe we can do another one that's like left arm. And then we'll do another one that is right. And one important distinction here is it's not capturing a gesture, it's capturing multiple examples of these positions. So, if you're like, oh, I want to capture it, the motion of a circle, it's not going to be able to capture something like that. But if you can distinguish specific poses, it's going to be easier to recognize that. Let's go ahead and train the model. Cool. So you can see here we got neutral, background, left, right. I'm actually really impressed. This tune's super good. All right, let's go ahead and export the model and upload it. All right, let's go ahead and copy the ID of the model right here. And we're gonna go back over to our TouchDesigner project. Again, we can just duplicate the Teachable Machine component, and then we'll go ahead and paste in our new ID and then hit download model. It might pop up with a little red X as it's downloading. And there it is. Cool. So I'll put down a null so we can see the values that we're getting. And now you have your super, super easy, lightweight model that can detect if someone is in front of your installation. So I could imagine using this to basically trigger some type of video playback or use it for a number of different examples. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take our original image detection model, and I'm going to use that to trigger a number of different visuals. And I'm just going to show you a couple different network configurations to show how to swap between some different visuals that we've made in TouchDesigner and how to trigger some different audio stems. So let's make a way of being able to show and transition between different movie file ends depending on what we see here. One very easy way of doing that is to, for example, place a couple of movie file ends, and let's do the banana and another one like the butterfly. Let's go ahead and fit this to, I'll go into the common section and set this to parent panel size. And let's do another one that's going to be the water. And then maybe like a constant for the background. I'll set this to use the parent panel size as well. So probably the easiest way to configure this is by putting a level after each one of these. And then what we can do is we can fade the opacity depending on what the value is. So here we can go into the post section and then go ahead and set the opacity of the background here. And then for Torin, maybe we'll snag the video device in for me. And then from here, I'll also put a level. We'll put the opacity of the level for myself. And then for the banana, we'll set the opacity And then the water is going to be the water bottle. And then I guess the butterfly will be hand. I don't know. So now what we can do is composite all these together. So I'll click on one of them, shift drag across all of them and connect them together. And I'm just going to add them together. So you can see now, if I set this as the background, the second I start to bring in another piece, it'll kind of crossfade over to that. There's the hand. Cool. All right, so that's a quick, simple way of doing that. The other option is to potentially just like switch between them individually. And for that, I'm going to show you more of a programmatic approach for this. And the other thing is I'm actually going to maybe order these to be the same order that we have in our channels here. So I think it's background, then me, and then the water bottle. So I'm going to kind of rearrange these a little bit. I want this background. Then we want the banana, the water bottle, and the hand. Okay, so what I'm going to do next instead is, instead of just compositing them or using the levels to fade them in and out, I'm actually going to use a switch. And what I want to do is be able to programmatically switch between each one of these based off the index here. And what I want to be able to do also is kind of have a threshold for it. So I want, maybe if it's above like 90%, then I'm going to trigger it to switch this to the specific index. And the way that we'll do that is we're actually going to use a chop execute. And so what we can do is basically make these event listeners to see whenever these channels change. So I'm going to right click on the null here, and then I'm going to go to the dat section and go to a chop execute. And notice that we're getting this value change right here. That's turned on. So these are basically different callback functions. And whenever one of these values change, we're going to get that information. And one thing to notice is that we actually get information about the channel. So let me print this information. I can print the channel dot name, and I can also get the channel dot index, and I can also print out the value. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the text port, and you can do that by going into the dialogues and clicking on the text port, or on a Mac, you can hit Option T, and that will open it up here. So we can see if I move around or bring my hand in, there we go. We can see that it prints off the name of the channel, the index of the channel. So that means the order that it comes in here, and then the actual value that we're getting. So what we can do here is we can actually programmatically change the value of this switch. And one thing I like to do is maybe instead of directly changing this value, we'll change a constant instead, because that might allow us to apply some easing to it. So I'm going to place a constant down, and I will put a null afterwards, and then I'll put it into an active mode. And then over here on this index, I'm going to drag and drop and place a reference. So now if we change the value of the constant here to 1, for example, then it'll switch to index 1. And let's figure out how we can programmatically write to this value right here. A really easy way of getting the reference to it is by just making another constant. So I just duplicated this one, and while selected on the very first constant, open up the name, click on it right here, and you can see that there's this constant 0 value. We're going to click and drag from that one onto the other constant, and then drop it onto the value portion right here, and paste a reference. And notice we get our little Python expression that tells us how we can programmatically read and write to that value. So it's constant for dot par const 0 value. So I'm going to cut that expression and then delete this. And in here, what we can do, we can start by, instead of printing it, let's take constant for, and let's just set its value here to the index of the incoming channel. But the problem is it's also going to trigger it for something that has a smaller value. So right now, you can see it's just going to kind of jump around a lot. What we want to do is check and see what the value is. So if the value is greater than like 0.9, then we want to actually set the index. So let's see. Right now it's on me. And now if I hold the banana up, look at that. It only triggers it when that operation happens. That's great. Configure this like a proper project. I'll put an out top down, so that way if we put this project in perform mode, we would be seeing these actual visuals. The other thing that we can do too is that we can actually put a lag in between these two, and then we can turn on the blend between inputs, and then it should kind of crossfade to that next element. Cool. All right, so the next thing I want to do is trigger a couple audio files. So I already have some different audio snippets that I created with 11 Labs. So I actually have those saved locally over here with a couple different MP3 files. The thing you want to make sure to do is keep any media files like images and audio local to wherever you save your TouchDesigner project. So I made a folder called audio, and I just put these all in here. So I'm going to drag and drop these into the project. And then I'm going to kind of space them out a little bit. All right, so by default, all of these audio files are looping. So I'm going to go ahead and click on one of them and then shift, click, and drag over all of them and turn the repeat tab on to off, so they only play once. Now we want to be able to send all these to one audio device out. So we're actually going to put a math chop down, and then we're going to select all of them again and connect a wire. And then in the math chop, we're going to combine the chops together by just adding them together. And I'll right click on this one and connect it to an audio device out, so that way we can play any of them. And I'll just do my default sound output. So now from here, I'll cue one of these.
The banana.
All right, so what I'm going to do to make this process easier is give these the actual names of the channels. So I'm going to call this one banana. This one,
Club Mate.
don't need that one.
Background.
Background.
Water bottle. Taurin. And
Okay, so now that we have these actually labeled, what we're going to do is we're actually going to programmatically trigger these different audio clips whenever the name of this specific one gets above a certain threshold. One thing I like to do is kind of try writing a script first to do whatever I'm trying to achieve. So I'm going to start by placing down a text stat, and I'll put it in an active mode. I'm going to get a reference to this hand operator. So I'll get OP in parentheses hand with a capital H. And then what I want to do is get a reference to the Q. So notice if I click on the text here, it drops down the name Q pulse. So I'm going to get .par.q pulse. And then the way that we trigger a pulse button is we call .pulse with parentheses on it. And what we can do here is I can right click and I can hit run script, and it plays it. So we're going to kind of generalize this a little bit. I'm going to cut this little script and delete it from this text file, and I'm going to go back down to our chop execute. So now here, if the value is greater than 0.9, we're both going to change the index, but also we're going to trigger the, we don't want to always trigger the hand. So one thing to note too is that we have access again to the channel.name, and we have access to the channel.index, right? So using this information that we have the channel name, how could we modify this command right here so that instead of just triggering the hand, we could trigger it based off of which channel has been activated? I'll give you a second to try to figure out how we can modify it. So what we can do is instead of just manually triggering the hand, we can use the channel.name.
Taurin. Taurine. And Taurine.
So one thing that you'll notice is that this is actually getting triggered way too often. And it's because the classification might still be nudging around when it's between 0.9 to 1. It's actually triggering it almost like every frame. And so if it's on the same classification, what we want to do is only trigger it one time. And a way we can do that is we can store whatever the previous trigger was. So let's do that. Let's create a variable called previous, and we're going to set it equal to, let's maybe just use the index, like previous index, and let's set it equal to 0. We're also going to be modifying it, so we need access to that variable inside this function. So we'll define it as a global. And then inside here, we can check, okay, if our current channel index does not equal the previous index, then we'll switch the index and we'll play the audio. But one thing that we need to do as well is we need to reset what our previous index was. So previous index is actually going to become our new index after we have triggered it. So now it will only trigger once it's detecting. So let's try that.
And Taurine.
Even though this is running every frame, it's only going to trigger that audio whenever it switches to a new classification. Maybe one other thing that we could try doing is setting up the machine learning model for the person detection to reset a video when someone steps into the frame. So one thing that can happen is that maybe you're playing a video in an installation, and then when someone enters the room, you want to start the video from the beginning. So let's actually configure that. Let's go ahead and start off by bringing a movie file into our TouchDesigner project. I already made a folder called video that has some little 4K waves, and I'm going to drag and drop that into the project. And the way that we can reset the video from the beginning is just by hitting this Q pulse button right here. And what we want to do is trigger that whenever the background goes from a value anywhere above 0 back down to 0. And a super easy way of doing that is by connecting a chop execute to this. And instead of using the on value change, we can turn this off. We'll use the from on to off recognizer. The other thing that we can do is we can specify which channels we want to listen to. So in this case, we only want to listen to the background channel. And now this little function right here from on to off, I can delete the other helper functions actually, so it's a little clearer. What I'm going to do is print, reset. So let's see what happens. If I open up the text port and I move back in, we'll see that it printed reset. And I have another log coming in from elsewhere. So we can see reset did trigger. And what we want to do is just go ahead and trigger this pulse button programmatically. Another easy way of doing this as well to figure out what the snippet of code is for this pulse is kind of the same technique I was showing earlier. Let's put a constant chop down. And then what we can do from here is make sure that you've clicked on the text for Q, and then take this text Q pulse, and we're going to drag it over to the constant. And in this value section, we'll paste a reference. And now you can see, okay, we can cut this reference right here. And we're going to go back over to our chop execute and paste it in, and notice what this reference is. So we're getting a reference to the operator waves 4K right here. And then we're getting a reference to the parameter called qPulse. And what we want to do is actually trigger the pulse function. So we'll call dot pulse on it. And now let's see if this works. If I move out of the frame and back in, it reset. Cool. All right. One other thing that I want to mention as well is that I'm gonna bypass this to keep my frame rate up, because playing back the 4K video is hefty. One other thing that I want to mention as well is that on Windows, generally you can only use one webcam, so you may not be able to run both of these models at the same time. Another thing is that you might notice if you start to put a bunch of these into your project that the save time will slow down. And that's because it's basically bringing the entire machine learning model into your TouchDesigner project. So one way to get around that is to actually take your files here, save them as a tox file, and make sure that they're saved in a folder next to your project. And in this case, I'll make a folder called Talks or Talkses, and we're going to give it the name Teachable Machine 3 or Teachable Machine Pose. And from here, the main thing that we can do is go into the common section and turn on enable external talks. And what that will do is instead of embedding this entire talks file inside this project, it will actually just bring it in from this talks file here. But the one thing that you want to make sure to do as well is make sure that this external talks path is set to the right location. So by default, I think it was getting pulled in from my downloads. So I want to go back over to this talkses and make sure that it's pointed to the right path. That's super important. And notice that it's a local path, right? This is super, super important. It's kind of similar to how if you drag and drop a movie file or an audio file into your project, if it's in your downloads folder and then you send your TouchDesigner project somewhere else, it's not going to be able to find the movie file. But if you keep everything local to the same project structure, it's going to be able to reference a local folder path. I'm going to put this project file on the Patreon, but I'm going to disable the video devices for 2 of them because on Windows, you most likely can only use 1 video device in at one time. A way to get around that is by using the spout or siphon, spout cam. Hopefully that helps give a number of examples for how to use these different models. And I'm really excited to see the type of things that you're going to create using these projects. People have used this in so many interesting contexts too, for making different interactive artworks. Also in the space of accessibility, people have used this in a medical setting. And so I'm really excited to see what type of possibilities this will open up for people in the TouchDesigner space. Thanks again for following along. I'm super excited to see what you all are going to make using this. Look forward to seeing you in the next one.